If Esther were a television drama, this morning's episode would begin with one of those familiar recaps, previously on Esther, and then we'd see a variety of short clips: Queen Vashti refusing the king, an orphan girl called Esther being crowned queen, Mordecai uncovering a conspiracy against the king, Haman rising to power, Mordecai refusing to bow, a decree being read placing every Jewish family under a sentence of death, Esther standing outside the throne room, the king extending the gold scepter, Esther's banquet, Haman walking home convinced life could not be better. Then we would hear the music changing, the camera slowing, carpenters, heavy timbers, the repeated strike of a hammer, a set of towering gallows beginning to rise against the evening sky, 75 feet high, enough for the whole city to see. Haman watching with satisfaction. Tomorrow morning, Mordecai will die. Fade to black, to be continued. That's where we left the story. And most of us would expect today's episode to begin there. Would Esther reach the king? Would Mordecai escape? Would Haman succeed? Instead, the camera cuts somewhere completely different. A palace bedroom. One restless king. One sleepless night. And then just those simple words. That night, the king could not sleep. Now, we don't know why. He'd been to a big, heavy banquet. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe he was just wondering, what on earth is it that Esther wants to ask me that she's not asked me yet? Maybe it was a whole host of other things. But he couldn't sleep. And history begins to turn on what appears to be an ordinary night for the king. But running through Esther is a refrain that the narrator never actually says. But in this chapter, we now begin to hear it being whispered. It just so happened. It just so happened Esther found favor. It just so happened Mordecai overheard a conspiracy against the king. It just so happened his loyalty was recorded. It just so happened nobody rewarded him. It just so happened the king could not sleep. And it just so happened that when he couldn't sleep, he asked for the record of his reign to be read to him. And it just so happened that there was a courtier there who took them and happened to open them at the pages where he read what he read. And it just so happened Haman arrived at precisely the moment the king was puzzling over an omission, asking how to honor Mordecai. Coincidence after coincidence? I think it's what some of us like to call God incidences. And it's amazing how many of those happen when you pray. While Esther is waiting, while Haman is plotting, while the gallows are being built, God is already at work. Nobody in the story can yet see it. Esther cannot, Mordecai cannot, Haman certainly cannot. At this point, almost everybody has a plan. Haman has a plan. Esther has a plan. The king thinks he has a plan. But another purpose is unfolding beneath them all. And it just so happened that the verse of the day from my Bible app this morning is Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Now in Esther, we've not yet seen that purpose fulfilled. The gallows still stand. The decrees remain in force. Nothing appears to have changed. But for the first time, we begin to sense that Haman's plans no longer have the final word. The tide has started to turn. Not because anyone has taken control, but because God never lost it. Last week we talked about discernment walking at the pace of trust. Esther acted courageously, yet she also waited. She prayed and fasted as did all her people. And she's still waiting and perhaps having her own sleepless night, not knowing if her strategy will work. not knowing if when she finally speaks and asks for mercy, the king's temper will flare again in spite of his smooth words and his promises. She's committed to a faithfulness that's trusting but doesn't yet know the outcome. Chapter 6 reminds us that God's silence is never absence. But while Esther waits behind the palace walls, another person's waiting outside, Mordecai. He remains where he's always been, at the king's gate. No applause, no reward, no recognition. His faithfulness has slipped quietly into the background, until quite unexpectedly the king asks a question that changes everything. What honour or recognition has Mordecai received? Why would he ask that? Because that was their culture, to honour. And the reply, well, nothing's been done for him. Nothing. No reward, no ceremony, no public thanks for saving the king's life. There's something we all recognise in that moment. Most of us don't spend our lives standing before kings or saving their lives, but we do know what it's like to wonder when faithfulness is gone unnoticed, to keep serving, to keep loving, to keep praying, to keep doing the right thing and wondering quietly, does anybody even care? Does anybody even notice? Maybe it happens at work, within your family, within the church. And maybe it's not actually recognition that we're seeking. Maybe it's just to know that our faithfulness matters. It does. It really does. Because the question the king asks is pivotal for what happens next. To everyone else, the fact that Mordecai was not rewarded may have looked like an administrative oversight or a deliberate slight. Whatever the reason, in his sleepless state, it caught the king's attention. Yet had Mordecai been rewarded years earlier, there would be no reason to honour him now. Even the delay becomes part of God's timing. And as I've said, it just so happens Haman arrives. And he's come to ask permission to execute Mordecai before breakfast. But before he can speak, the king asks, what should be done for the man the king delights to honour? It's almost comical, this point. Haman immediately assumes there's only going to be one answer. Well, it's me. Someone else's story. Pride arranges things so that the story becomes about him. How often does that happen in our own hearts? Someone else's success becomes our disappointment. Recognition given to another somehow feels like recognition taken from us. Mordecai's different. He simply keeps serving faithfully at the king's gate, and yet Haman is grasping for that honour. And as it unfolds, as he gives this image of what he himself would love to receive, to get that honour, that moment when he's told, excellent, yes, do it for Mordecai. Could you imagine what his face would be like? I don't know about you, but do you remember the television programme, Yes, Prime Minister? Nigel Hawthorne as the servant who advises the Prime Minister, who plots and schemes behind the scenes, and then somehow the Prime Minister kind of figures it all out and he's put in his place, and you see him blustering with contained rage that it's not worked out for him. Mordecai has to contain himself. He has to go and he has to get those things, and he has to honour Mordecai. He's forced to give Mordecai what he wanted for himself. Can you imagine that walk? Every step through the city, every smile from the crowd, everyone pointing and cheering. And again, Haman has to proclaim, this is what's done for the man the king delights to honour. Only the day before, he imagined hearing those words spoken over himself. Now he's speaking them over the man he planned to hang. And we can laugh in some ways, not because humiliation is amusing, but because we know that pride eventually collapses beneath its own weight. And when Haman reaches home, he tells his wife and his friends everything, and their response is remarkable. Mordecai, if he's of Jewish origin, you'll surely come to ruin. They become the first ones inside this story to recognize what we've begun to see. The tide is turned. They've seen it. Haman couldn't, but he's now woken up to it. Something greater than Haman's plans are now at work. Jesus says, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And Esther illustrates that kingdom truth centuries before Jesus speaks to remind these people. But this chapter's not mainly about honour. It's about identity and worth. Haman needs that honour because without it, he doesn't know his worth. Mordecai's identity and worth rests somewhere deeper. Faithfulness matters whether anyone applauds or not. Our culture measures significance by visibility. But God's kingdom asks different questions. Was I faithful? Did I love well? Do I seek justice, mercy, and truth? Did I become more like Christ? Paul answers those questions in Philippians 2. Jesus didn't grasp at status. He emptied himself. He took the form of a servant. He entrusted himself completely to his Father. And he descended before he was exalted. Therefore God highly exalted him. The Father gave what the Son never grasped. Not humility as a strategy for reward, because we have to be careful of that one, but a love so secure in the Father's care that there was no need to cling to anything at all. Mordecai is not Jesus, but his quiet faithfulness points us towards the one who trusted his Father perfectly. And there's another question this chapter asks us. What is your "it just so happened" story? Maybe there's something that comes to mind. A conversation you had with someone at the right moment that gave you an answer that you were desperately needing. Someone handing a book to you that you read and it spoke to your heart. Maybe a person you almost never met, but they've made a difference in your life. A delay that proved to be, in actual fact, a gift. Looking back, we can begin to join the dots. Or maybe you're thinking, I don't have one of those stories. Maybe all you can see today are the gallows, a diagnosis, some bad news. It's important that we recognize that. Esther isn't inviting us to hunt for hidden messages in every coincidence, and nor does it promise that every painful experience will soon make sense. Most of the people in the story, as we know, didn't understand what God was doing while it was happening. It's only afterwards that they recognize his faithfulness. And sometimes that's true for us too. Sometimes we can only see God's hand by looking back. And sometimes we may not understand this side of eternity. That's why our confidence is never in these things. Our confidence is in Christ. If you'd stood outside Jerusalem on Good Friday, what would you have seen? A betrayal, an unjust trial, Roman soldiers across a sealed tomb. Nobody looking at those events would have imagined God was accomplishing salvation. And yet Easter teaches us what Esther's been teaching all along. God is often doing his deepest work precisely where we can least perceive it. And that's why as Christians we can wait with hope. As chapter 6 closes, the gallows are still standing. Esther still has not spoken. The decree has not been overturned. Nothing is yet resolved. Yet everything is changing. While Haman was building the gallows, God was arranging a sleepless night. While Esther was waiting, God was working. While Mordecai believed he'd been forgotten, God had not forgotten him for a single moment. So maybe this week, we're not simply asking, what am I waiting for? Or even, what is my it just so happened story? Ask something deeper. Whose plan am I trusting? Mine or God's? For many are the plans in a person's heart, but the Lord's purpose prevails. That's why we can keep taking faithful steps, not because we know how our story will unfold, but because we know the one who's already writing it. Amen.